It's my great pleasure tonight to introduce my former Ph.D. student, Dr. Michelle Palmer, to you. Michelle is currently in charge of the Phytoplankton section at the Ministry of the Environment's main office in Toronto. So if you have any algal blooms to report, talk to Michelle afterwards. Prior to that, for a year, Michelle was the Ministry of the Environment's main biologist working on the limnology of Lake Simcoe. If anyone has a cottage on Lake Couchiching in the audience, or if you have anything, if you're a Lake Simcoe person, you can ask Michelle that too. Prior to that, she was a PhD student in the biology department at York University. And of all the students that I had, she actually was the closest to being a real limnologist, by which I mean a person that studies all aspects of lakes. She's worked on the physics of lakes, the chemistry of lakes, and the biology of lakes, and then also on application of what we understand about the biology of lakes to lake management. And so I think we're going to hear about all of those things in her talk today. 2 years prior to that, Michelle actually worked as a scientist in our lab at the Dorset Environmental Science Center and spent 2 years out in the bush in a canoe or flying in planes to Algonquin Park every day essentially for 2 years. So the PhD was from York. She did a master's degree with Tony Ricciardi, one of Canada's finest invading species biologists at McGill prior to that. The last thing I'll say by way of introduction is that the greatest pleasure for a teacher is to be surpassed by their students. And so I have to tell you that I have had those pleasures from Michelle, and I continue to have those in the future, as you'll see in the material that you'll see presented tonight. Dr. Palmer.
Thanks, Norman. Norman is exaggerating just a little bit. But, and so first, thank you, everybody, for coming. This is really great to see this many people here. And everybody can hear me in the back? No? How about now? Is that better? Yeah. Everybody good? Just raise your hand or something like that if I start getting quiet, and I'll speak up. So tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about parts of my research for my PhD. And as you can see by the title, one of the things I focus on is how our lakes in this region have changed over the last 25 years. And I approached my PhD, one of the things that I was really interested in is how our lakes are changing over time, and in particular how we're driving those changes. So that was kind of the focus for my PhD. Now I apologize, this is a little dark, so you probably can't see it very well. All it is just a picture taken from Google Earth. You know, you can go on Google Earth and pull up pictures. This is a picture of Muskoka area. And for me, every time I look at this, it's so surprising to remind myself about how many lakes we have. Our lakes are scattered throughout the landscape, throughout Muskoka and the surrounding counties and districts. And so lakes are really important to our area. And as everybody here, of course, knows, lakes provide us with a number of benefits. And so I've just listed a few here. In particular, a lot of people will use drinking water, particularly at the cottages, from the lakes. Lakes are a very important part of tourism in the area. A lot of the types of economy that we have here are tourism-based. Lakes allow us to do a lot of recreational activities. So, of course, things like boating and swimming, those sorts of things. Fisheries. That's commercial fisheries as well as recreational fisheries, which a lot of us, I'm sure, participate in. As well, lakes can affect our property values, so properties along shorelines, that sort of thing. That's another benefit that lakes provide us. As well, lakes overall improve our communities, and they offer us social and economic opportunities. So with all these things in mind, that kind of tells us we really need to understand what's happening in our lakes and ensure that our lakes are healthy and they continue to be healthy. So to do that, we need to understand our lakes, study them, and see what things affect the lakes and what we can do to make sure that there aren't negative things that happen in our lakes. So human activities, there's a number of things that we do that can impact our lakes. So here I just have a very simple picture kind of illustrating what can happen. So what we have here is just my very simple picture of what a lake looks like. Obviously not very representative, but around each of our lakes we have a number of things that can be impacting the environment in the lake. So for instance, we have development, so cottages and permanent residences around our lakes. We have acid rain, which of course there's a long legacy of acid rain impacts to our lakes. We have things such as roadways, so we can have inputs from road salt that's used for winter maintenance. As well, we also have things such as introductions of invasive species. So one of the ones I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with is the introduction of Bythotrephes, the spiny water flea, which has spread through a number of our lakes. So all of these different human activities, they can then impact the physics and the chemistry of our lakes, and also the biology. And then when you have these changes occurring, what can then happen is that those changes in the physics and the chemistry can actually impact the animals and the plants that live in the lake. So for my PhD, I focus on how a number of different human activities affected the physical and chemical environment of our lakes, and how that in turn affected biological communities. Now I focus on zooplankton. So there's a couple of little zooplankton here at the end of this arrow, at the very bottom there. So what are zooplankton, and why do we care if our activities are affecting zooplankton? Well, zooplankton, and I have a picture of a few of them over on the end there. Zooplankton are these small, mostly planktonic animals that they play a very key role in transferring nutrients through our food web. So we have primary production, algal production at the base of our food web, and then zooplankton, a number of zooplankton actually feed upon that production, and then the zooplankton in turn are preyed upon by fish. So they form a very important link in our food web. So that's why we care if zooplankton are changing over time. So a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to first go into the methods. So this was, what lakes did I actually sample, what I measured when I was out there. And this is kind of fun, I think, to see, what you do when you actually go on a lake and sample. I think that's interesting, at least to me. And then I'm going to talk about some of the results that I found, and in particular focusing on how our lakes have changed over time, and what are some of the factors that are causing those changes. And then I'm going to summarize and talk about some of the implications of what I found. So here what I'm showing is a map of the different study lakes. So everybody will be familiar with this area. So we have Prairie Sound, Nipissing, Haliburton, and Muskoka. So all these little dots here are the lakes that I sampled. Now, there are two main sets of lakes. The first of those lakes that are shown by the black circles here, and there's about 40 of them. And these are lakes which they cover a very large range in lake type. So they run all the gamut from being brownwater lakes to clear water lakes, lots of different types of landscapes around them, so development, no development. And these lakes were originally sampled in the 1980s by researchers from the Dorset Environmental Science Center. Now I resampled those lakes in 2004 and 2005. So that's my first set of study lakes. Now the second study lakes are the ones that are shown in the white circles. And there's 8 of these. And these are the long-term monitoring lakes that have been monitored since the 1960s, 1970s by researchers through the Dorset Environmental Science Center. So again, so there's 2 sets of lakes. There's a smaller set of lakes that have been monitored continuously over time for the last few decades. And there's a larger set of lakes that were sampled originally in the 1980s, and I resampled them in 2004 and 2005. So again, my study period that I'm going to focus on is between 1981 and 2005. And all the sampling occurred during the ice-free season. So this is May through October. Now, the lakes are, like I said, they're different types of lakes. So there's different types of access to the different lakes. Some you can actually access by road. Others you can portage to, and then some you actually have to take a float plane into. And these in particular are lakes in Algonquin Provincial Park. Some of the lakes in there we would have to fly into to access. So this is covering a large range of lake types and how much human activity is going to be actually affecting all of these lakes. And all the sampling was done at the deepest point of the lake. So on each sampling trip to each lake, what I would do is I would take a number of different measures. And one of the main measures I would take is water temperature. So I'd go out with a temperature probe, and I would measure the temperature in the lake starting from the surface, and then every meter down to the bottom of the lake. And what you can do with that is then you can look at the different parts of your lake. So what you have within a lake is during the summer period, when you start getting warming, you get that upper surface of the water. You know when you jump into a lake in the summer and that upper surface is nice and warm? That's the epilimnion. That's the part that's warmed by the air temperature. Now below that, you have the metalimnion, and this is the area of the lake that is quickly cooling, so it has a very steep temperature gradient. And then at the bottom, you have the hypolimnion of the lake. And so this is the area of the lake that once the lake stratifies during the summer, that bottom area is no longer in contact with the upper reaches of the lake. It's no longer in contact with the atmosphere. So you use your temperature profiles to characterize these different strata of the lake. And this, again, I did every month from May to October, and again from the deepest point of the lake. Now as well, I collected a measure of chlorophyll, so that can be used as a proxy of the phytoplankton abundance. And this was taken from the euphotic zone. The euphotic zone is basically the depth of the lake, the amount that's lit by the light. Now, there we go. And as well, at each sampling strip, I also collected water chemistry. Now, I looked at a number of different parameters of water chemistry. I'm just going to talk about a few of them today, though. Now, as well, I also collected zooplankton samples. As I mentioned, I was looking at what different things are happening in the lake and how they're impacting the zooplankton. And now for the zooplankton, I collected them again from the deepest point of the lake. And the zooplankton were collected by a number of vertical hulls with a net. So I had a net, would lower down into the water column and collect the zooplankton that way. Now as well, because I was interested in whether or not Bythotrephes, the spiny water flea, had invaded the lakes and could therefore be impacting the zooplankton communities, I also collected for Bythotrephes. Now I only did the collections for this invader during one summer and late in the summer. And to look for Bythotrephes, what I did was I actually sampled at the deepest part of the lake, as well as 4 random areas throughout the lake. And using this technique, we have a greater than 95% likelihood of ensuring that if it's there, you're going to capture it and recognize that it is present. So that was quickly some of my methods that I used. Now I'm going to go and start into the results. Now overall, I found that our lakes have indeed changed drastically since the 1980s. In particular, for today, I'm going to focus on the changes in lake temperature, water quality, and the zooplankton communities. So one of the first things that I started to recognize was that over the 25-year period that I was looking at, I realized that the lakes have gotten warmer. And so what was happening is that what I found was that in the epilimnion, so that's the top layers of your lake, which is represented by this red line here, I found that over the 25-year period, the upper surfaces of the lake were increasing in temperature by about 2 degrees Celsius. Now the metalimnion, that's the middle layer of the lake, I found that that was increasing by about 1 degree Celsius over time. In contrast, the bottom layers of the lake, the hypolimnion, that part that's divided from the rest of the lake and doesn't mix with the rest of the lake during the summer, that part of the lake hadn't actually changed in temperature over time. So what this amounted to was that overall, our lakes, if you look at the whole water column and put it all together, our lakes have increased in temperature by about 1 degree over the 25-year period. Now, with these changes in temperature, if you can imagine, you have the upper layers of your lake getting warmer, whereas your lower levels of your lake are not getting warmer. So what this causes is it's actually so that you're getting differences in density. So the upper layers of the lake, the differences in the density from the upper layers to the bottom layers is changing over time. And that's causing the lakes to be more stable. And so by stable, what I mean is that it's actually harder for those lakes to mix. So at the end of the summer season and the fall, what you have is when your lake mixes again, it all becomes the same temperature. Well, it's actually harder for the lakes to do that now because of these differences in temperature between the upper layers and the bottom layers. And with this change in how easily the lakes can actually mix, what that could end up causing is that we may have a delayed fall turnover period, so a delayed period of mixing in the fall. So instead of perhaps earlier in the record, so in the 1980s, the lakes may have mixed at a certain date in the fall, whereas in the end of this sampling period, in the 2004 or 2005 period, the mixing period may actually occur a week or so later. And if this is the case, that may actually be contributing to one of the other things that's been found is that the ice-free period at these lakes has actually increased by about 3 weeks over the 25-year study period. So what's actually causing these changes in water temperature? Well, the primary driver that seems to be causing these changes is changes in air temperature. So what I found was that over the 25-year study period, air temperature had actually increased by about 2 degrees. And this was in correlation with the changes in water temperature, suggesting that the changes in water temperature were being driven by the changes in air temperature. And now, these changes in water temperature and air temperature were largely focused in the fall period, so during the September-October period. So where we're seeing the warming is in the fall. So moving on to water chemistry, I looked at a number of water chemistry parameters. I'm just going to focus on a couple today. What I found, the first thing I found was that lake acidity has changed over time. So as I'm sure you're all aware of, there's been a legacy of acid rain impacts where lakes have become acidified or more acidified than they were historically due to acid rain. Now what I found was that over the 25-year period, there's actually been a decrease in sulfate, which is a primary acidifying agent within the lakes. So this first set of bars here, so we have in the blue here, this is the sulfate levels in the 1981 to 1990 period. And then in this red here, we have the values from 2004 to 2005. And as you can see over time, the sulfate levels have dropped. Now, in response to that, we've actually seen that the lakes have become less acidic in terms of alkalinity and pH. So here we have alkalinity, and historically, and more current, and as you can see, alkalinity has increased. Now similarly, we've seen that there's been a change in pH. So pH is here, so over time we've seen that pH has gone up. Now this change in pH is interesting because a pH of 6 tends to differentiate lake communities that are typified by more acidic, there are species that can deal with acidic conditions as opposed to communities in lakes that have a pH above 6, where you have a different set of community, a different set of biota that live there. And so over time, I found that 25% of the lakes actually went from below a pH of 6 to above a pH of 6, suggesting that there's going to be a community change where those communities now resemble more lakes which are non-acidic. Now, the primary driver likely causing these changes and reductions in acidity are reductions in acid rain. So here what I'm showing is sulfate deposition over time. This is for the area around Dorset. And so as you can see that over time, the amount of sulfate being deposited has decreased. And this is likely driving that change in the acidity variables I just spoke about. Now, interestingly, these changes, the amount of acid rain falling has decreased by about 50% over the 25-year period. However, the changes in the chemistry are not as great as we would expect based on a 50% decrease in acid rain. And one of the reasons for that may be because calcium has actually decreased. So, over time, looking at, this is a measure of calcium. So down on the bottom here, I'm showing calcium levels in the 1980s as compared to calcium levels in 2004, 2005. So any dot that's below the line, this 1-to-1 line, represents a lake which has had a decrease in calcium over time. And what we're finding is that those decreases in calcium are counteracting some of the changes in acid rain. And so that the improvements in acidity are less than what we would actually expect based just purely on the amount of decrease in actual acid rain. So why is calcium decreasing? Well, there's a couple of different things that may be contributing to these decreases. The first being that in this region, as I'm sure everybody's aware of, we often have very thin soil that have low mineral content. So when you have long-term acid rain, what can happen is that acidic precipitation can actually leach the calcium and the minerals from the soil. And because of the acidic precipitation occurring for so many decades, it's actually pulled out a lot of those minerals from the soil already. And then what's happened is when we've had reductions in acid rain, we've actually had reductions in how much of the calcium and the minerals are being pulled out of the soil. So it's kind of like a double whammy as to not only have we had long-term acidic leaching pulling calcium and minerals from the soil, now we're also having where there's less acid rain, and so we're actually getting less pulling, less leaching of that calcium. So it means that it's driving some calcium declines. Now as well, another thing that could be contributing to these changes in calcium over time is that is our logging cycles. So trees can be they can conserve, or they can be reserves for calcium. There's a lot of calcium in the material within a tree. And so if we have logging where everything's removed, that's actually removing calcium from the watershed. And so that can be contributing to our reductions in calcium that we've been seeing over time. Now I also found that our lakes are getting saltier over time. So here what I'm showing is chloride, historical chloride, current chloride, and then sodium here. Historical sodium and current sodium. What I found was that over the 25-year study period, both sodium and chloride had increased over time. Now the likely driver of this change is road salt. Salt, particularly sodium chloride, but there are other forms that are used for road salt, is used as a common de-icer during the winter. And about 370 kilometers of roads within Muskoka are salted during the winter. And there's other sources of road salt as well. You can have road salt that can run into our waterways from storage facilities and also from the disposal of waste snow. And chloride in particular, they're conservative ions, so once they get into a water body, they tend to stay there. So that means that over time, with more and more inputs of sodium and chloride, we're going to get higher and higher levels of sodium and chloride in our waters. Now, our lakes are saltwater lakes, so they have very low sodium chloride levels naturally. However, it is concerning that we are seeing these increases. And with increases in populations, that sort of thing, we would actually expect that we would see more increases in the use of road salt, and so that may contribute to greater increases in sodium and chloride over time. Now, I also found that the increases in sodium and chloride were greater in lakes which were near areas with greater populations and greater in lakes that were near winter-maintained roads. So that gives more evidence to the fact that road salt is likely contributing to the increases in sodium and chloride over time. Now another water chemistry parameter that I found is changing over time is phosphorus. So I found that over the 25-year study period, total phosphorus has decreased. So here, again, similar type of graph. What I'm showing is total phosphorus levels in the 1980s as compared to 2004 to 2005. As you can see, it's decreased. And on average, the decrease in our lakes is about 20%. And so that's a fairly large decrease in our lakes, which are typically oligotrophic, meaning that they typically have relatively low phosphorus levels. And the cause, or the things that are driving this are more questionable. There's been a suggestion that these decreases in phosphorus may be driven by lower stream export during the spring. So the amount of phosphorus that's entering a lake through your streams is dependent upon two things. Is how much water is flowing in and what's the concentration of phosphorus actually in that water. And what's been found is that it's actually the concentration within the water that's changing. So it's not the amount of water flowing into the lake, it's the amount of phosphorus that's within that water. And it may suggest that some of the processes that actually control terrestrial release of phosphorus during the spring period, just before and just during spring snowmelt, may be contributing to some of these decreases in total phosphorus. But there's research being done right now to look at what are some of these factors that are controlling our phosphorus levels over time. Now, with the decreases in phosphorus, there's been a corresponding decrease in chlorophyll A. Like I said earlier, chlorophyll A, it can be used as a proxy of phytoplankton abundance. And so what we've seen is that as the total phosphorus has decreased, so too has the chlorophyll amount. And that's because there's a relationship between, with chlorophyll A representing phytoplankton abundance. Phytoplankton are, of course, dependent upon your nutrient levels, and the primary nutrient being total phosphorus. As well, as I mentioned, I was looking to see if the spiny water flea, the invasive, had actually spread. And what I found that it has indeed spread. So Bythotrephes, a bit of a quick background. It was first detected in inland lakes in Canada in 1989. And is now currently found in over 50 lakes within the Muskoka area. And I found that it was present in 8 of the lakes that I sampled. And in the 1980s, of course, it wasn't present in any of them, and now, of course, now it's in 8 of those lakes. So here's a map from a recent publication. Oh, I don't know if you'll be able to see the colors, unfortunately. But basically, it shows a number of lakes. In green are lakes which are not invaded. In red are lakes which are invaded. And if you can see the colors, there's a spread of red throughout Ontario, indicating that Bythotrephes is spreading throughout the province. There's a picture of Bythotrephes up here on the top, if you can see it, it's not too dark. Now, Bythotrephes is spread by a number of different factors. In particular, human activities are contributing to its spread, particularly boating activities, fishing activities, because they can get stuck on, for instance, your fishing line or your bait wells in your boat, those sorts of things. And so we're actually contributing to the spread of Bythotrephes by our activities. As we move between water bodies, we can accidentally move it as well. And it can also be spread by means such as fish and birds to spread them, as well as they may move through connections between waters. So a stream or a river that connects two water bodies, one that does have Bythotrephes, one that doesn't, that stream could actually transport Bythotrephes between those two water bodies. So we've seen that there's a number of changes that have occurred in the lakes, changes in water temperature as well as changes in water chemistry. So the next question I had was whether or not these changes were actually impacting the zooplankton in the lakes. And I found that overall, yes, there were a number of changes that were occurring in the zooplankton communities. Now, this first change that I'm going to talk about is a change in total abundance of zooplankton over time. So in this graph, on the bottom here, I have total abundance of zooplankton in the 1980s versus total abundance of zooplankton in 2004, 2005. Any dot that's below this line means that over time, the number of zooplankton in that lake has decreased. And overall, a majority of lakes have shown a decrease in zooplankton over time. Now, this decrease in the number of zooplankton within the lake was largely driven by the decrease in total phosphorus. So if you think back to the fact that total phosphorus is a primary nutrient that is required by phytoplankton, the phytoplankton are in turn eaten by the zooplankton. So you can see how if you have a decrease in the amount of available nutrients, that can cause an impact on the phytoplankton, which in turn appears to be affecting the zooplankton. Now as well, I found that the richness, so the number of zooplankton species present in a lake, as well as the diversity of zooplankton within a lake has actually increased over the 25-year study period. So here on this graph, what I'm showing is the ice-free mean zooplankton richness within the different lakes. And I'm showing it in 2 types of lakes. Lakes where Bythotrephes was absent, and lakes where Bythotrephes was present. And this is the historical value and the current value. And what I found was that over time, those lakes which did not have Bythotrephes showed a 25% on average increase in the number of zooplankton that were present in those lakes. In contrast, lakes which had Bythotrephes didn't show that increase. So that's showing the negative impact that Bythotrephes can actually have on our zooplankton communities. Now, the richness and diversity of zooplankton was also impacted by pH, temperature, and total phosphorus. So in those lakes that had an increase in pH, we also saw an increase in the richness and diversity of zooplankton. And in lakes that we saw an increase in the water temperature, again, that contributed to increases in richness and diversity. And in those lakes that either had increasing TP or had smaller decreases in TP, that also contributed to our increases in richness and diversity. So moving on to another characteristic of zooplankton. This graph here shows the relative abundance of large zooplankton species in the 1980s versus 2004 to 2005. And over time, we found that the relative abundance of large zooplankton has increased over time. So all the dots are, or most of the dots are above this 1-to-1 line. So that means that there's been a greater abundance, relative abundance of large zooplankton such as the daphnids, a picture of one which is shown at top, as opposed to some of the smaller ones, like this Alona down here at the bottom. Now, this shift towards a greater relative abundance of large zooplankton species was driven by a number of things. In particular, the decreases in total phosphorus have contributed to this, in that larger species tend to have a different starvation threshold. They can actually deal with starvation better than some of the smaller species. Now, temperature and chloride also impacted the relative abundance of the large zooplankton. Now, interestingly, what tends to happen as temperatures warm is that animals tend to get smaller. Now, the temperature did have that same direction of impact here. So in those lakes that got warmer, the animals tended to get smaller, but the impact from the total phosphorus was greater. So that overall, we were seeing that the animals got larger, even though it was getting warmer. And I also found that chloride was important. And this was surprising because, as I said earlier, our lakes are softwater lakes. And they still are softwater lakes. The levels are very low. The salt levels within our lakes are well below the guidelines for we would expect impacts from the salt levels. However, I did find that chloride was having an impact. So this suggests that perhaps when you combine multiple different drivers and things that are impacting zooplankton, that could then make the lakes more sensitive to changes in chloride. So in summary, I found that the lakes in Muskoka have changed extensively since the 1980s, including changes in water temperature, water quality, and the spread of invaders. And these changes have altered the zooplankton communities of the lakes. Now, the changes occurred across a large number of lakes. In total, there was about 47 steady lakes. So that means that changes are happening across the region. And this suggests that human activities are actually causing changes on a widespread scale. And so we need to continue to study our lakes and understand what things change our lakes to be sure that we can support efforts to make sure that our lakes are healthy for future generations. So I'm happy to take any questions at this time. Yes.
Did you study any shallow lakes where the temperature might be uniform through the whole lake?
I did have one lake which tended to, it's well-mixed lake, it's a very shallow lake. It didn't actually behave differently though. But no, so what would happen is that the whole lake would warm. It just wouldn't have that hypolimia, so it wouldn't have the cool area. So most of the water column would actually warm in that lake.
Okay.
Yeah, phosphorus was central to a lot of what you said, but I'm not clear whether I should be thinking of it as something good or something bad. You have a whole food chain going there, but do we need the algae?
So phosphorus is, for most freshwater areas, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient for algal growth. But phosphorus is required by everything to grow, and it's an essential nutrient. It's something that's needed for there to be life in our lakes. It's when we get excess amounts of phosphorus that then becomes a concern, and it can promote extra growth of algae, and that can of course lead to blooms and those sorts of things. So it's something about the level of phosphorus So it is required, tends to be a limiting nutrient, but when we have increases in phosphorus, and it gets to excessive levels, that's where we can have things like algal growth.
Does that algae break down in the wintertime and consume oxygen doing that?
So the breaking down of algae, the concern is in particular during the fall period. So what happens is during the summer, when your lakes stratify, you get that layer at the bottom that I mentioned earlier, that it's separated from the atmosphere. So over the summer season, which is the growing season when your algae be growing, as that algae dies, falls to the bottom of the lake and it decomposes, and that process will use up oxygen. And so what could happen is that over the season, over the summer and going into the fall, you could have your oxygen in those lower reaches of the lake could start reducing because of the processes that break down the algae and other things that are using, like the animals that live there that are using up the oxygen, that can reduce your oxygen levels. And so that could, there's particular species, such as a lot of fish species, that are sensitive to oxygen levels. So if you could have where the fish are being impacted by those low oxygen levels over the stratified period. Yeah.
When you travel from lake to lake doing your studies, do you take precautions to not introduce fighting water flea to?
Yes, always.
And my
Yeah.
second part of that is, are you informing fishermen the same
Yeah.
techniques?
So my master's was in an invasive lab. So we studied invaders, the whole lab did. So I'm very aware of the issue that there has been reports of researchers of spreading invasive species. That has occurred. So I always took precautions. We use a chlorine wash. We did this for all of our lines, all of our boat, anything that came in contact with water, we would ensure we washed, and then we would dry it to make extra certain that anything that could be on that equipment was no longer alive and couldn't be transported to another lake. And then what we did is we accessed a number of lakes with cottagers' permission through their property. So of course I would talk to them, especially if I found the invasive spiny water flea in their lake. I would of course talk to them. And we also worked with a number of people to put up some of the signs that the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters has for, you put them at the access to a lake, and it says, please wash your boat, etc., and give some information about different species that could be spread. So we worked to put those signs in many places as we could.
Michelle, can I answer that?
Yeah.
The single most important thing is to dry your gear for 6 hours. So it's the most effective. There's been 2 years of work done at the University of Minnesota to test what you have to do to kill not just the live spiny water fleas, but the eggs in the female's brood pouches and the resting eggs, the overwintering eggs, inside intact animals. And so all of those animals are killed by 6 hours of air drying. So if you think you've been to a place that has the spiny water flea, just dry all of that stuff for overnight, or for at least 6 hours, but have it dry, and you won't be spreading any live invaders.
Sorry.
Did you extrapolate the results or the amount of change you've seen in these parameters going forward? And at what point will the lakes be very negatively impacted? They won't be healthy lakes anymore.
Yeah, no, I haven't done that, and for a couple of different reasons. As we're getting, stressors are changing and more things are coming in impacting your lakes, it may actually change the trajectory of how things are responding. And for a number of my lakes, because I had the 2 points in time, it makes it more difficult because you just have that change over the two 1980s versus 2004, 2005, so you can't really create the extrapolation to see what would happen. It's been done for other areas. For instance, for Lake Simcoe, that's a hard water lake, so it has much higher salt levels in it, and that it was looked at. And based on the current rate of change in Lake Simcoe for the salt levels, it was estimated that in 140 years it would actually reach salt levels which were detrimental to organisms and could actually kill them. So I didn't do it for these lakes though.
Conversely, it's going backwards as well. If we went back to the 40s and the 50s, your chart would be rising from them as well, probably.
Sorry, so
It's reversed. The lakes have been getting warmer for longer than 25 years. They've been getting warmer since the last ice age. right?
And so there's a thought there that the climate changes that we're seeing currently are a reflection of longer-term changes that have occurred.
Because I'm old, I've seen the ice in Niagara disappears, so that's why I'm moving north, because I'll fix the snow. So, and like, it's not just 25 years.
No. That's a very good point. So this isn't, I just looked at a 25-year period, but these are processes that are playing out over decades. They're processes that, these are continuous things that can impact lakes. And so it can be happening over a much longer time. And so something like climate change is really something that occurs over not just decades, but hundreds and hundreds of years, not even longer. So yeah, so it's maybe a reflection of what's happening. The way I like to look at the changes in water temperature that we've seen here is this may be an indication of what we can expect going forward. So a lot of the climate change projections suggest that for our region, in the next 100 years or so, so by 2099, we're going to see a 2 degrees increase in temperature in our water. Well, that's what I saw here over this 25-year period. So it's kind of, you can look at this and say, what happened here in this 25-year period, and is that what we can then expect going forward as we see a 2 degrees Celsius change in temperature, which is similar to what was here? Yes?
I'm not sure that I've been able to pull it all together, but
That's my fault.
Can I make a couple of comments? Except for 5 young people, we're all good looking, but we're all over the age of 55. That scares me a little bit. Who cares about what's going on here? We need to care more. I go back a long time in Muskoka. If I go back to the 70s, what we were concerned about were phosphates in the water and the Sudbury smokestack. As far as I know, we've scrubbed the smokestack and we've got the phosphates out of the water. Help me to understand in your 25 years, have we done the right things? Is it working? Or are there things that are going against it and saying it's not working as well as it should have because?
That's a really good question. So the changes that we've made, the improvements, particularly for the reductions in acid rain and the legislation, that sort of thing, to reduce the phosphates entering our lakes, they made good progress, but we're still seeing that we need more progress. We need more initiatives put forward so that we can further reduce acid rain, further reduce the phosphorus that's going into our lakes. Now, on top of that, we're also seeing that there's other stressors that are coming in, so invasive species, climate change, and those can then actually modify what's happening because of phosphorus and acid rain. So we're getting, it's termed kind of multiple stressors or cumulative impact. So we're seeing that all of these just different stressors are working together to cause changes in our lakes. So yes, the what we've done has been progress and has made great improvements, but we have more to go, basically. That makes sense.
Can I add to that?
Yeah.
Everything she said was right, but just to let people know, the rain used to be too acidic for about 90% of our lakes in Muskoka. The rain is still too acidic for about 50% of the lakes in Muskoka. So so if we don't do anything else, we actually are going to see additional lakes in Muskoka suffer. In Sudbury, you mentioned Sudbury, there has been a 90% reduction in sulfur emissions. Valley Inco is currently spending, I think, $2 billion. It's between $1 and $2 billion to reduce their current emissions by another 75%. They're hiring about 2,500 people to execute that program. Let's just hope that the Americans do something similar, because the vast majority of the acid rain that comes to Muskoka these days certainly does not come from Sudbury. We have to show leadership by making sure Canadian sources are dramatically reduced, and hopefully that will encourage others to follow suit. Okay.
Can you comment, Michelle, on how your findings relate to lakes that are tea-colored, high sulfur organic matter? Did you have to go within your study and do these comments or these general findings apply to your lakes?
They do. So this lake study that I worked on, it had a selection of lots of different types of lakes, and there was a number of tea-colored lakes within there. And so they were behaving similarly to the other lakes. So we're still seeing that the lake waters are warming. Now in the tea-colored lakes, it's actually interesting because the lake warming can be increased in those because when you have the darker water, so the tea-colored water, so part of that is due to dissolved organic carbon that's in the water. And so with those particles and that darkness of that water, it can actually retain more heat. And so your upper surfaces of those lakes may actually, or for some of them I found was actually getting warmer, but it can also restrict how deep the warming goes. Because it's darker, so that warming doesn't get the light can't penetrate as far in, so you don't get warming as deep in those lakes. And so things like Bythotrephes, I did find it in a very dark brown water lake, a shallow lake at that. So Bythotrephes can spread to those lakes. But yeah, so probably just under half of my lakes were brown water lakes.
All the lake associations talk about water quality. There's concern. I frankly don't know what one lake thinks is water quality and what another one thinks is water quality. Do you have a good definition of what good water quality is that we're supposed to be looking for?
So that's in which parameters contribute to water quality?
What parameters will tell you you've got a lake that has good water quality? Now, from your talk, it sounded like something with a good zooplankton community is good, and that requires phosphorus and algae. Well, some people say reduce the phosphorus, get rid of the algae. We like our acid lakes. Now, what's a good quality lake?
So our lakes naturally span a very large gradient of what those lakes look like. So we naturally have lakes that vary greatly in the chemistry of the lake, and that's so. What I'm trying to say is that there's a great range in what's good water quality based on the characteristics of a particular lake. Now, a lot of the parameters that tend to be looked at to look at water quality are the total phosphorus levels, and total phosphorus, again. Different lakes have a different background level of total phosphorus. That's what's natural for those lakes. Some lakes naturally do have blooms, but the worry comes from when human activities are actually increasing the phosphorus that goes into those lakes. And that's where we start having issues with poor water quality due to extra inputs of phosphorus from our activities.
Then it sounds like good water quality is the way the lake was before we got here.
Yeah, background levels are often used as a reference as to what a lake, typically unimpacted from humans, would look like, and as a basis for what we would try to move towards.
Going back to TP, total phosphorus, is it safe to assume that a lot of the inputs of natural phosphorus is driven by runoff, precipitation, the amount, duration, seasonal inputs? Mm-hmm. Did you do any study on that? Because it's very clear that with weather patterns changing, I call it climate change, I'm one of those believers, that's changing dramatically. This year, for example, we had our freshet in March, the earliest ever. I do know that April rains have reduced over time. We tend to have our rains later in the spring. Would that drive, I would assume to some degree, that natural inputs of the TP would vary greatly from year to year with climate change or variability in precipitation patterns?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And I didn't look at the relationship between total phosphorus and climate over time, but certainly it does play a role. But what we look for are the long-term trends, looking at a number of years, if overall those have contributed to changes. So if there's been changes in TP that can be detected over that long period of time that's greater than the interannual variation. So that would show that there's something else driving those changes
as opposed
to climate. Oh, absolutely, it can be looked at, yes.
I would.
Yeah, and there's researchers that are looking at this in much more detail than I have for total phosphorus for the Muskoka area.
One quick question: are you? I think you're comparing a 10-year period of record to a 1-year period of record.
So I'm looking at. I see what you mean. Between the 1980s, so the lakes were originally sampled between 1980 and 1981 and 1990, so that period, and then I resampled them in 2004, 2005. Yeah.
Okay. Just a quick question. Is it a comparable comparison? Doing a 10-year period of record to one, and it's all its entities as you described here? Because we know about trend through time. Some parameters, depending on what level of scale you're trying to present, that could be problematic, but that's not an issue there, is it?
No, and that was one of my first concerns, right? To go from sampling lakes over a 10-year period, and I sampled them over 2 years, well, maybe I'm just picking up, variation that's typically there between years. So actually, I tested and made sure that, so I looked at things like the year that the lakes were sampled in. Were they particularly warm versus cool, and did it differ as to what my results were if I used different, if this lake was sampled in 1981 and this lake was sampled in 1990, did it differ as to how the changes I was seeing in those lakes and those sorts of things? And I found it wasn't an issue at all. So it really was that the changes were happening over the long term. So the 1980 period was very different than the 2004-2005 period. And luckily, we have, through the Dorset Environmental Science Center, those 8 long-term monitoring lakes, which are sampled every single year. And so what I actually did is I compared the patterns I was seeing in the larger data set, the larger set of lakes, to those lakes that are sampled every single year, and I found they were showing the same patterns over time.
So in that regard, the 1 year period of record was, say, the rainfall that year, on average, comparable to the average of the 10-year period.
Mm-hmm.
Going back to this precipitation, the potential of hydrolyzed phosphorus,
Right.
that's, I find that, I just don't quite understand that part of it. But.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I'm going to address this properly, but so what I looked at was whether or not the years that the lakes were sampled in, and so lakes that were sampled in different sets of years, or were sampled at different periods, so 14 years in between versus 15 years in between, and I looked to see if any of my results differed based on that, and they didn't. It came out as the exact same results. And then I also was able to compare those discretely sampled lakes to that long-term trend in the 8 lakes, which were sampled every year. And I found them the same pattern. So if I was finding that in those lakes that were sampled at 2 points in time, if they showed a decrease in TP, those long-term monitoring lakes were also showing a similar decrease in TP. And that was across the different parameters. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It seems most of your presentation is based on water quality in the middle part of the lake or the deeper parts of the lake. But a lot of us cottagers are very concerned about water quality close to shore. And so, and what I'm noticing over the decades is that the clarity of the water is reducing and the algae formation on rocks is increasing. Do you concur, and what causes that? If you can generalize on that, and what can we as cottagers, if anything, do anything to try and improve the quality of the water close to the shore, which I think we cottagers are very concerned about.
Okay. So when you're talking about your lakes are getting darker, is it they're becoming more brown water, sort of? Is that the darkness that you're
I'm
seeing?
just noticing in our area of Lake Rosso where the clarity of the water is greatly reducing. You know what I mean? It's not as clear.
Right.
Not as,
and Lake Rosso. So
I don't know if it's because of the influence of acid rain 20, 30, 40 years ago, where maybe the rocks were a little cleaner, but now there seems to be substantial growths of algae on the rocks than what we saw 30 to 40 years ago, even 20 years ago. And clarity of the water is nowhere near what it used to be.
So
in the last 10 years, I'd have to say anecdotally, just with personal experience.
I haven't worked in Lake Rosso, but I can say that the changes in the algae that you see in the rocks, that could be due to changes in the nutrient inputs to the lake, especially if you're talking about the near shore. If there's been increases in the phosphorus that's going into the lake, that could be contributing to increased algae if you're seeing increased algae over time. The changes in the water clarity, it could be due to, again, I haven't worked on Lake Rosso, so, but it could be due to changes in the algae, the amount of algae that's in water, that can affect your water clarity. There's other things that are happening, but I don't think would be impacting Lake Rosso as much. But we're seeing that there are also increases in dissolved organic carbon, which is the material that can make your lake more brown water, and that's increased over the last 25 years as well, and that's likely due to warming temperatures, so climate change related. So what can happen is that when you have warmer air temperatures, your catchment surrounding your lakes, so that land area, you can have greater production, decomposition of organic matter. And then when you have precipitation events, that can flush that into the lake, and that can increase the dissolved organic carbon that's actually in your water, and that can affect the clarity. So yeah, so unfortunately I'm not more familiar with Lake Ross, so I'd say if there's particular things that are happening there.
Do you think it's equally important to be studying the quality of water closer to shore as opposed to mainly studying the middle part of the lake?
Yeah, so there's monitoring programs for both. So there's a lot of nearshore monitoring programs as well, particularly in the larger lakes. We do have, there's monitoring nearshore versus offshore. Now the lakes that I've sampled, they were historically sampled from the deepest point of the lake. And so for consistency and comparisons over time, I measured at the deepest point of the lake so that they could be comparable.
Bythotrephes will affect the chlorophyll to total phosphorus ratio.
Bythotrephes could. Yes.
I'm going to ask Norma questions to see if that's the data on Bythotrephes. Is Bythotrephes in the crop?
Yep.
Yeah, so that's, I sort of keep track anecdotally or just historically changing what there's a lot of changes over the years, and some of them could be due to that.
This is related to global warming, but we've all probably heard how the oceans are acidifying with increasing carbon dioxide. Has that been looked at on lakes, and is there any way to tease that out from acid rain?
So the impacts of carbon dioxide on inland lakes, type thing?
Yeah.
It has. I'm not familiar with that literature, though. I haven't looked into it at all. So unfortunately, I can't address that. Sorry.
What would pollen do to the water? I mean, the last 6 years we've had significant excesses of pollen, which ends up in the lake and actually looks like an algae bloom at sometimes.
Yeah.
That stays suspended in water for a while and then it goes to the bottom?
Pollen can stay suspended in the water column for a while. It's so light, right? And it can affect your water clarity. So it can, if you get a lot of pollen coming in, it can actually reduce the water clarity of the water. And then as that breaks down, it could contribute a source of nutrients, that sort of thing, to lakes. Sometimes we get pollen samples that are sent in with the thought that it is an algal bloom because it can look like that.
Right.
Yeah.
So what would it do?
So the pollen itself?
Yes.
I haven't heard of any, doesn't mean there aren't any, of issues where that's caused eutrophication or high phosphorus levels in a lake, but it certainly would be a source of nutrients. I just don't know how large that source would actually be.
Thank you.
What's going on with mercury over the last 25 years? Are you finding anything about that?
No, I didn't look at mercury at all. There's been some studies that have been done throughout the province of looking at mercury levels in fish in different lakes. And there are a number of lakes where mercury has decreased over time. There are some lakes where it hasn't changed, though. But I think there's been quite a few studies that have shown that there are mercury levels decreasing, but not across the board.
Is it true that these lakes around here are granite-based, right? They're granite lakes.
Yeah,
so
we're on
there's a certain amount of mercury more natural than.
I don't know. I don't know if Norman or someone else in the room would know. I'm not sure how much mercury comes from different sources or something like that.
Yeah, there is a little bit of mercury in the granite, but that's not the source. 2/3 of the if there have been whole lake mass balances done, and the mercury is coming. The vast majority of the mercury that actually gets into lakes is coming from the air directly. And the scary thing is it can take a very long time. There's a big experiment going on at the Experimental Lakes area, or that has been going on, and to actually track the rate at which mercury moves through watersheds, and it can take a long time. So for things to actually improve. So in this area, mercury is still our largest sportfish contaminant for sure, and we have some of the lakes with the highest mercury levels anywhere short of areas that were downstream of chlorophylline plants in West Ontario that have a specific industrial source. So the things that give us high mercury levels in our lakes are their organic content. Mercury is strongly bound to this tea-colored matter in brownwater lakes have higher mercury problems than clear water lakes. The length of our food chains, we have fascinating food chains on our lakes with lots of invertebrate predators, one of which you've seen. One of my worries has been that Bythotrephes would actually increase mercury levels in fish because it's adding a level to the food chain, but that seems not to be the case. But we do have some interesting animals like the opossum shrimp, and if a lake has an opossum shrimp, the mercury levels in the fish will be much higher. The other thing is acid rain did have a huge impact on the methylation of mercury. Mercury has to be methylated before it's taken into food chains. And as sulfur levels actually decline in lakes, which Michelle showed, there actually should be less methylation of mercury, because it's actually sulfate-reducing bacteria that do that. There's less sulfate, which is one of their substrates. So I'm hoping that the mercury levels in our fish will actually decline a little bit because of declining sulfate levels in lakes.
Is there less naturally occurring mercury in limestone?
You know the answer to that, Jim? Do you know if there's less mercury in limestone in the coarthas? I don't think so. I don't think so.
So you mentioned salt due to direct impacts from humans. When you studied pristine lakes, what were the major changes, or were there any? Were most of the other problems due to atmospheric?
So the results that I've shown here are actually from a range of lakes, including pristine lakes. Now, the one difference I did notice between what could be considered more pristine lakes, the lakes that have less human activities around them in the Algonquin Provincial Park, is they actually had lower increases in the salt levels as compared to lakes that were, say, closer to some of the cities within Muskoka.
That was the only.
That was the only difference that came out between them. Yeah, between.
So it's mostly due to atmospheric deposition and stuff, or changes for the global.
So yeah, so a lot of the stressors I talked about here, a lot of the things that are changing are partly due to atmosphere. The other thing that I found was that Bythotrephes was not in any of the lakes in the park, so that was good.
Where can we get a list of the 50 lakes that have noted to have Bythotrephes in them? Like you said, there's 50 lakes that have been noted as having spiny water fleas?
So there used to be a map of them on the Ontario Federation of Anglers and Hunters website, the Invading Species website. I don't know if that map's still there. Norman, do you know if that map's still there? It is?
Yeah, that last year's talk, I don't know if that talk was recorded on the website. The last slide I showed was the lakes that have Bythotrephes. If it's still on the website, then that map would list all those lakes.
If you Google invasive species watch, you go on there, they do have the recording page. You can actually look by lake.
How big is one of those things?
They're quite small, but they're big compared to a little zooplankton that they eat. So.